On June 12, 2019, somewhere over the Nevada desert, the United States Air Force was about to learn a painful lesson. Red Flag, the most realistic air combat training exercise in the world, was in full swing. Nellis Air Force Base hosts this twice-yearly event where the best pilots from around the globe test their skills against America's most sophisticated air defense systems. The U.S. forces had deployed everything. F-22 Raptors, the world's most advanced stealth fighters. F-15 Eagles with powerful radar systems. AWACS aircraft coordinating the entire defense network. Ground-based radar stations scanning every inch of Nevada airspace. This wasn't just training. This was a demonstration of American air superiority. The defensive network was designed to detect and intercept any threat. From stealth aircraft to cruise missiles, nothing was supposed to get through. But in the next 20 minutes, something would happen that would shock every American commander present. Two British aircraft, working together as a perfectly coordinated team, were about to penetrate this impenetrable defense, not with stealth technology, not with electronic warfare, but with something far more elegant: psychology. The Royal Air Force was about to prove that the most advanced military technology in the world could be defeated by understanding one simple truth. It doesn't matter how good your systems are if you're looking in the wrong direction. If you want to know how the RAF outsmarted the most advanced air defense network on Earth, how two completely different aircraft worked together to create an unstoppable attack, and what this reveals about the future of air combat, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happened that day changed everything military planners thought they knew about modern warfare. The attack was devastatingly simple. A Eurofighter Typhoon flew high and fast, deliberately making itself visible to every American radar system. At the exact same moment, older Tornado GR-4 aircraft flew at 200 feet, invisible in the radar's blind spot. The Americans committed everything to stopping the Typhoon. The high-altitude threat. The obvious danger. And by the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. The Tornadoes had penetrated deep into American airspace completely undetected. If this had been real combat, critical targets would have been destroyed. The billion-dollar defense system had failed, not because of a technology problem, but because of a thinking problem. This incident became known among military aviation circles as one of the most brilliant tactical demonstrations in recent history. It proved something that many defense analysts didn't want to admit, that in modern warfare, psychology can be more powerful than technology. But to understand how the RAF pulled this off, we need to understand the aircraft involved, the tactics they used, and most importantly, the gap in American defensive thinking that made it all possible. Let's start with the two aircraft, the Eurofighter Typhoon and the Tornado GR-4. On the surface, these seem like an odd pairing. The Typhoon is one of Europe's most advanced fighter jets. First flight in 1994, entered service in 2003. It's a multi-role fighter capable of speeds over Mach 2, equipped with advanced radar, sophisticated electronic warfare systems, and beyond visual range missiles. This is a fourth-generation plus fighter designed to compete with the best aircraft America has. The Typhoon can engage targets from over 100 kilometers away. It can track multiple targets simultaneously. It's fast, agile, and deadly. The Tornado GR-4, on the other hand, is much older. First flew in 1974. This is a Cold War-era aircraft originally designed for low-level strike missions against Soviet targets. By 2019, the Tornado was approaching the end of its service life. The RAF would retire it completely by 2019. Compared to the Typhoon, the Tornado seems outdated, slower, less sophisticated, but the Tornado has one capability that makes it incredibly valuable. It can fly extremely low, using terrain-following radar to maintain altitudes as low as 200 feet while traveling at high speed. And this capability, when combined with the Typhoon, creates something extraordinary. The concept the RAF developed is called a high-low tactical pairing. It's not a new idea. Military forces have used high-low tactics for decades. But what made this particular approach so effective was how it exploited a specific weakness in American air defense psychology. Let me explain how modern air defense works. When you're defending airspace, you have sensors constantly scanning for threats. Radar systems at different altitudes and ranges. Fighter jets on combat air patrol. AWACS aircraft coordinating everything. All of this information feeds into a command center where controllers make decisions. Which threats are most dangerous? Which need to be engaged first? Where should fighters be positioned? This decision-making process depends on something called threat assessment. Controllers constantly evaluate which aircraft pose the greatest risk. A high-altitude, fast-moving target with advanced capabilities naturally gets prioritized. It's the obvious threat. The one that could launch long-range missiles. The one that could penetrate deep into defended airspace. Controllers are trained to focus on these high-end threats first. It makes sense. You deal with the most dangerous problem before worrying about lesser threats. But here's where psychology comes in. When controllers focus their attention on a high-altitude threat, when they commit resources to tracking and intercepting that target, they create blind spots elsewhere. They're not doing this intentionally. They're following their training, prioritizing the most obvious danger. But this creates an opportunity. If you can present a threat that demands attention at high altitude, you can simultaneously exploit the low-altitude blind spot that creates. This is exactly what the RAF did. The mission planning was brilliant in its simplicity. The Eurofighter Typhoon would fly a profile designed to look as threatening as possible. High altitude, around 40,000 feet. Fast speed, approaching or exceeding Mach 1. Flying directly toward defended airspace, using its radar actively, making its presence known. Everything about the Typhoon's behavior screamed major threat. American radar would pick it up from hundreds of miles away. Controllers would immediately classify it as a priority target. Fighters would be scrambled to intercept. But the Typhoon wasn't actually trying to penetrate the defenses. Its job was something completely different. The Typhoon was a distraction. A problem manager, as the RAF called it. Its purpose was to create a problem that American controllers had to solve, to draw their attention upward, to make them commit resources to the high-altitude threat. While this was happening, the real attack was coming from a completely different direction. The Tornado GR-4S took off around the same time as the Typhoon, but their flight profile was completely different. As soon as they reached the exercise area, they dropped to extremely low altitude, 200 feet above the ground. In some cases, even lower. The Tornado's terrain-following radar allowed it to maintain this altitude automatically, following the contours of the desert landscape. At this height, the Tornado was exploiting the same physics that made the Buccaneer so effective in the 1980s. The radar horizon effect and ground clutter. Remember, radar waves travel in straight lines. They cannot bend around the Earth's curvature. If you're flying below the radar horizon, ground-based radars simply cannot see you. Even airborne radars have difficulty detecting low-flying aircraft because the radar returns get mixed up with reflections from the ground. This is called ground clutter. Mountains, buildings, vehicles, even variations in terrain, all of these create radar returns. A low-flying aircraft's radar signature gets lost in all that noise. It's like trying to hear a whisper in a crowded stadium. The Tornadoes also maintained strict electronic silence. No radar transmissions, no radio communications unless absolutely necessary. They relied on GPS navigation and terrain-following radar, which only looks downward and wouldn't be detected by enemy sensors. To the American defensive network, the Tornadoes were essentially invisible. They appeared on radar screens as nothing more than occasional blips that could easily be dismissed as ground clutter or sensor noise. Now here's where the coordination becomes critical. The timing had to be perfect. The Typhoon had to present itself as a threat at exactly the right moment. Too early, and the Americans might have time to deal with both the high and low threats. Too late, and the Tornadoes might be detected before the distraction was in place. The RAF planned this down to the minute. As the Typhoon approached from one direction, making itself as visible as possible, the Tornadoes approached from a different angle, staying low and invisible. American controllers did exactly what the RAF predicted. They saw the Typhoon on radar, high altitude, fast speed, advanced capabilities, heading directly toward defended territory. This was classified as a DZA, high priority threat. F-22 Raptors and F-15 Eagles were vectored to intercept. AWACS crews focused their attention on coordinating this interception. Everyone was looking up. The Typhoon was doing its job perfectly. It was managing the problem, creating a threat that demanded attention and resources. Meanwhile, the Tornadoes continued their low-level approach. They flew through valleys when possible, using the terrain itself as additional cover. They stayed below 200 feet, sometimes descending even lower when the landscape allowed it. To anyone watching on radar, there was nothing unusual happening at low altitude. Just the normal clutter you'd expect from ground features. The Tornadoes covered mile after mile, penetrating deeper into the defended airspace. And here's what's remarkable. It wasn't until the Tornadoes were already deep inside the defensive perimeter that American controllers even realized they were there. Some radar operators had noticed occasional low-altitude contacts, but these had been dismissed as anomalies. Ground clutter, sensor noise, nothing to worry about, especially when there was a major threat at high altitude that needed immediate attention. By the time someone realized those low-altitude contacts might actually be hostile aircraft, the situation had already collapsed. This is what experts call the collapse of timelines. In air defense, time is everything. You need time to detect a threat, time to identify it, time to vector fighters to intercept, time for those fighters to reach engagement range, time to lock weapons and fire. This entire process is called the kill chain, and every step takes time. The whole point of modern air defense is to detect threats early enough that you have plenty of time to work through this chain. But the RAF's tactic compressed this timeline to essentially zero. By the time American controllers realized the Tornadoes were a credible threat, there was no time left. The fighters that could have intercepted them were already committed to chasing the Typhoon at high altitude. They were in the wrong place. Repositioning them would take several minutes, and the Tornadoes would have already reached their targets by then. The AWACS crews had been focused on managing the high-altitude interception. Shifting their attention to coordinate a low-altitude response would take time they didn't have. In the exercise scenario, the Tornadoes reached their simulated targets and delivered their simulated weapons. In real combat, critical infrastructure would have been destroyed. Command centers, radar sites, air bases, all while the defensive fighters were miles away, chasing a Typhoon that had never intended to actually penetrate the defenses. The shock wasn't a dramatic dogfight. There were no missiles fired, no aircraft shot down. The shock was watching the entire defensive timeline collapse, realizing that despite having superior technology and more resources, the Americans had been completely outmaneuvered. After the exercise, the debriefing sessions were intense. American commanders wanted to understand exactly what had happened. How had they been fooled so completely? The answer was uncomfortable. Their systems had worked perfectly. The radar had detected the Typhoon exactly as designed. The fighters had responded appropriately to the identified threat. The AWACS had coordinated the defense efficiently. Everything had functioned as intended. The problem wasn't technical, it was psychological. American doctrine had optimized for high-end threats. Stealth aircraft like the F-35 or Chinese J-20. Advanced cruise missiles. High-altitude bombers. This made sense given the threats America expected to face. But in optimizing for these high-tech scenarios, they had created a blind spot. Low-altitude threats were considered manageable, less dangerous than the high-tech alternatives. The doctrine assumed that if a low-altitude threat appeared, there would be sufficient time and resources to deal with it after handling the high-altitude threats. The RAF proved this assumption wrong. They showed that a coordinated high-low attack could exploit the gap between what American doctrine prioritized and what it considered secondary. The Typhoon wasn't trying to survive or penetrate defenses. Its sole purpose was to absorb attention and resources, to create a problem that controllers felt they had to solve immediately. Meanwhile, the real threat came from an entirely different direction, using decades-old tactics that had been somewhat dismissed in the era of stealth and advanced sensors. This exercise revealed several important lessons that military forces around the world are still studying. First, technology alone doesn't guarantee success. The Americans had better aircraft, more advanced sensors, superior numbers, but they still lost because they were outthought. The RAF won by understanding American psychology and doctrine, then designing tactics specifically to exploit that understanding. Second, old tactics combined with new technology can be devastating. The Tornadoes were using low-level penetration tactics developed in the 1970s and 1980s. These weren't new ideas. But by coordinating them with a modern fighter like the Typhoon, and by understanding how American controllers would respond, the RAF made these old tactics relevant again. This challenges the assumption that newer is always better. Third, coordination and timing are force multipliers. The Typhoon and Tornado by themselves weren't particularly threatening to American defenses. The Typhoon could probably have been intercepted. The Tornadoes might eventually have been detected. But by working together, synchronized perfectly, they created a problem that the defense couldn't solve. The whole was greater than the sum of the parts. Fourth, defensive doctrine needs to account for psychological factors. It's not enough to have systems that can theoretically detect and engage all threats. Operators and controllers are human. They will prioritize based on training and doctrine. If that doctrine creates predictable patterns, an intelligent adversary will exploit those patterns. This means defenses need to be designed not just for technical capability, but for psychological resilience. Since this exercise, American air defense doctrine has evolved. More emphasis is now placed on multi-altitude threats. Controllers are trained to be suspicious of obvious threats that might be distractions. Sensor coverage at low altitude has been improved. But interestingly, the solution isn't purely technical. Much of the adaptation has been doctrinal and psychological, training controllers to think about what threats they might not be seeing, encouraging them to question why an adversary is behaving in a particular way. The RAF's approach in this exercise reflects a broader philosophy in British military thinking. The concept of thinking warfare. The idea that victory comes from outthinking your opponent, not necessarily outgunning them. Britain doesn't have the defense budget of the United States. They can't match American numbers or always have the latest technology. But they can be creative. They can study adversaries carefully. They can design tactics that exploit weaknesses in doctrine and psychology. The British Tornado GR4 was retired from RAF service in 2019, shortly after this exercise. It had served for over 40 years, originally entering service during the Cold War. The aircraft flew its last operational missions conducting reconnaissance and strike operations in support of coalition forces. But this red flag exercise served as a reminder that even in its final year, the Tornado remained a capable and dangerous aircraft when used correctly. The principles demonstrated in this exercise remain relevant today. Modern combat aircraft like the F-35 emphasize stealth and sensor fusion. But stealth isn't invisibility. A coordinated attack that diverts attention away from a stealthy approach could be even more effective than the Typhoon-Tornado combination. Similarly, unmanned systems create new opportunities for high-low tactics. Drones could serve as the high-altitude distraction, being cheaper and not risking pilots if shot down. This red flag exercise of 2019 will be studied for years in military academies. It represents a perfect example of asymmetric warfare, using coordination and psychology to overcome technological disadvantages. The RAF didn't need the most advanced aircraft to win. They needed understanding of how their adversary thought. The lesson isn't that American air defenses are weak. The lesson is that no defense is perfect. Every system has assumptions built into it. An intelligent adversary will study those assumptions and exploit them. If you found this story fascinating, I have more incredible military aviation stories exploring real documented incidents. Check out the playlist to explore these true stories and please subscribe our channel. Thank you very much.